Okay, so when I was in my 20s, I thought I was pretty much stuck with the same set of skills I already had for the rest of my life. I was kind of good at some stuff and not so good at other stuff, and I just had to work with that. But as I learned more about skill development, I realised that pretty much everything we're good at comes from doing the right kind of practice, and that you can practice almost anything to get better than the vast majority of the population at it. So in this video, we're going to talk about skills that I think are really life-changing for anyone to learn, and I'm going to give you the best resources and tips I've found for starting the process of getting good at them. And we're going to start with the skill that's had the biggest impact on my life, which is talking to people. So this is definitely one of those skills where, when I grew up, I just thought, okay, there are some people who are just naturally better at it than me. But once you start looking into it, you realise that people who are good at talking to people are all kind of doing the same things, and that those are skills you can learn for yourself. And yet, it can feel kind of creepy and manipulative to learn techniques for getting better at talking to people, but it really shouldn't. Because the people who are good at talking to people tend to have just grown up in an environment where they're exposed to a lot of people and they just naturally get a lot of practice at human interaction. And if you haven't had that when you're young, there's nothing wrong with learning some skills to catch up, basically. So there are basically 3 books that I would recommend to anybody who wants to get better at talking to people. And the first one is obviously Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I've talked about this book a lot before. The title makes it sound creepier than it is, because this is really a book about being nice to people and becoming genuinely interested in the things they have to say. I'd also really recommend Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference. Chris was actually a hostage negotiator for a lot of his career, but the techniques he uses work great in everyday interactions with just regular people. So one of the central lessons of the book is something Chris calls tactical empathy, which is basically about learning to understand the other person's viewpoint, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, in order to understand the things that might motivate and move them. And this book's full of tiny little instantly actionable tips. Like, a lot of guides to conversation will suggest mirroring other people with phrases like, "What I'm hearing you saying is." But that actually sounds kind of awkward and even a bit creepy. And Chris suggests using a phrase like, "It sounds like," instead, which is actually a lot more natural. And then the third book I'd really recommend is Rory Miller's Conflict Communication, but I've already done a whole video about that, so just watch that when you get a chance. In the meantime, let's move on to the next skill, which is writing. And realistically, we are all writers now. Most of us have jobs that involve at least some element of writing, and even outside of those jobs, we're constantly writing, whether it's on social media or resumes or dating profiles. And what connects all of those things is that we're trying to convey our ideas and tell stories to other people in a way that builds connection with them. And writing is a lot like talking to people, in the sense that it's easy to feel like there's this sort of natural quality to it where some people have got it and some people don't. But realistically, just doing a few small things can really drastically change the quality of your writing. And after that, it feels a lot easier to move forward and practice it more. So one bit of advice I give to a lot of people is to keep a copy of George Orwell's Rules of Writing handy, and to check over your own writing to see when you've broken the rules in that. What you can also do is see when other professional writers break those rules, which will probably give you the confidence that there are people out there getting published and getting paid who you can actually write better copy than if you really put your mind to it. And then the book that I think can change your writing the most is not actually a writing book at all. It's called Made to Stick, and it's about how to create sticky ideas that readers will remember by doing things like making them concrete and credible, and getting people to care about them by attaching them to an emotional core. This is stuff that works for almost any kind of writing, because well-told stories are what makes our ideas memorable to almost everyone. After that, it really depends what you want to write. If it's books, I would really recommend Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. If it's marketing copy, then I really strongly suggest Copywriting Secrets by Jim Edwards. And if you want to write film or TV scripts, then John Yorke's Into the Woods goes into so much detail about the intricacies of plot structure that you'll probably never watch a film in the same way again after you read it. And then the rest of this stuff comes down to practice, but I think you can really see a massive difference in your writing in anywhere from about 3 to 6 months. But actually, one of the things that will most improve your writing is the next thing we're going to talk about, which is staying focused. So in the 21st century, when there are endless distractions available at almost every moment we're awake, focus is basically a superpower. If you can stay on task, the power of the internet makes it really easy to get a whole load of stuff done. But it's also super easy to get distracted by reading about roller coasters or airplane disasters for a whole morning. So a book I really recommend on focus is Chris Bailey's Hyperfocus, where he uses a series of diagrams that represent what he calls our attentional space, to explain why it can be difficult to stay focused when there are a lot of things competing for our attention. And the best ways to deal with this range from stuff you can do straight away to stuff that need kind of a lot of practice and commitment. So for instance, in the short term, you can make your workspace a more focused environment by getting rid of devices that can distract you, or by installing apps that stop you from constantly checking social media. And then in the slightly longer term, you can start learning to set your intention, which is almost like a form of meditation, where you consciously choose the thing that you should be focused on and continually gently draw your attention back to it when you start to feel it drift. I'm going to be honest, this takes a bit of effort, and for me it's been kind of an ongoing process, which is why I'm going to say this is probably going to take you anywhere from about 8 to 12 months. But one thing that really helps is building systems to eliminate distractions and prioritizing the stuff you should be focusing on, which brings us to our next skill, which is staying organized. By the way, I know I'm going through some of this quite fast, so if you'd like to read about it in more depth, I've got a free newsletter that comes out every week where I talk about productivity, organization, and all of these skills. I would love it if you signed up, link in the comments. Okay, so being organized is one of those things that used to make me feel like other people probably feel about foreign languages or playing musical instruments. I was just kind of like, maybe my brain just isn't set up to do this. And at one point my wife actually said to me, no offense, but your life is chaos. And at the time she said it, that was pretty much true. But over the last few years, with more and more stuff going on in my life, I've had to get really organized about how I manage my time and all the stuff I have to do. And the secret to it is pretty simple. Write everything down. If you make plans with your friends, write the date in a calendar. If you have a brilliant idea for an article or a joke or a social media post, write it down. If you've got things to do, birthdays to remember, or movie recommendations to catch up on, write them all down. It sounds simple, but it absolutely works. And maybe the biggest benefit of it is that it stops your brain from going around and around in what's sometimes called the rehearsal loop, where it keeps resurfacing other things that it knows it needs to remember and distracting you from whatever you're working on in the moment. And this is what was really a game changer for my ability to focus. Without mentally juggling stuff like bills, birthday presents, and household jobs I need to do, I'm able to use most of my mental bandwidth focusing on the stuff that's actually a priority for me. So I've got a whole other video about the 2 notebook system that I use to stay on top of both my daily to-do list and my longer term ideas, and I would recommend watching that when you get a chance. But this really doesn't take that long to implement. Writing stuff down is basically a habit. So if you start just writing stuff down every day, in a couple of months it'll become second nature, and then you probably won't be able to believe you weren't doing it before. And keeping notebooks around also helps with the next skill, which is drawing. And this is something I did a lot as a kid, but most of the time I was just copying other people's pictures and I couldn't ever really sketch out my own ideas or come up with anything really original. And I think a lot of people hit their 20s or 30s without ever being able to draw, and they decide that they're just not artistic and it's just not for them. But honestly, learning to draw to the point where you feel confident sketching stuff out on paper is actually pretty simple, and it will absolutely level up your life because it will make you feel more confident about communicating your ideas to other people. So the book that I recommend to almost everyone is called You Can Draw in 30 Days by Mark Kistler. It's full of really simple exercises that build on each other one day after another to take you from the point where you can't really draw anything to a point where you should be comfortable with shading, perspective, and drawing lifelike 3D objects. After that, how you take things further is really up to you. If you want to draw human figures, I really recommend Andrew Loomis's books, which are pretty easy to find online, or you might want to try Stan Prokopenko's video courses, which I think are excellent and which you can try a few of for free on YouTube. If you're into the more technical side of things, there are a ton of free resources available at drawerbox.com. I didn't really get into that so much personally, but I know there are loads of people who've had a lot of success with it. And like the book title suggests, you can get to grips with the fundamentals of drawing in about a month, and then I think it probably only takes about 100 days to get to a point where you're noticeably better at drawing like figures and human heads and things like that, especially if you draw every day. The main thing I would really stress though is that you can definitely draw. You can basically learn anything, and learning just one thing will help you to remember that, which is why the final skill on this list is maybe the most important one, and that is learning. So learning is what some people call a meta skill, in that it makes everything else easier to do. And it can get a bit confusing. There are lots of competing ideas about how to learn things quickly or efficiently, and obviously the best approach is going to partly depend on the skill you're trying to learn. But from learning a whole bunch of skills and reading a lot about the science of learning, I think there are basically 3 things that will help you learn almost anything faster, and those are deconstruction, directness, and retrieval. So deconstruction means you're going to pull the skill apart into the simplest chunks you can and focus most of your effort onto the 20% of them or so that are going to give you most of the gains. So for cookery, that might mean learning how to grill, saute, and braise, and like flavor match. Or for foreign languages, it might mean finding the 100 most common words in the language and focusing most of your vocabulary practice on those. Directness means practicing the skill in the way you're eventually going to be using it. So for instance, if you're trying to learn Photoshop or film editing, it makes more sense to pick some effects you like and try to recreate them than to just do endless tutorials for stuff that you might never use. Or if you're learning a language, trying to speak it very early can help focus your practice in a way that just endlessly memorizing verb tenses won't. This also ties into the final point, retrieval. Because a key finding of recent research on learning is that forcing our brains to work to retrieve information, rather than just reviewing notes, helps us form stronger connections in the brain and remember stuff better. So rather than just passively reviewing your notes, make a real conscious effort to test yourself on whatever you're learning, either by using flashcards or trying to write the stuff out from memory, trying to remember a skill rather than just immediately going back to the tutorial when you get stuck, or even just putting yourself in a situation where you're forced to use the skill with no kind of reference to back you up. And learning how to learn is honestly kind of a lifelong endeavor. But the thing about it is, as soon as you learn one thing, you understand that you can learn anything. And one great place to start is by understanding what we currently know about the science of learning, which is why I recommend watching this video next. Thank you very much for watching.